The India-Bangladesh relationship is in trouble. Just a year ago, Bangladesh's Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina declared that the two countries were enjoying a golden period in their relationship. And that seemed true at the time. Over the last 15 years, the two countries had helped beat back militant groups, resolved a thorny boundary agreement, and signed a number of key infrastructure and power deals. All of these achievements brought India and Bangladesh closer than they had been for decades together. And then, everything changed in August 2024, when Sheikh Hasina's government collapsed. The last few months haven't been easy, as tensions between India and Bangladesh have increased steadily. Many in Bangladesh are furious at India for backing Sheikh Hasina, whom they see as corrupt and dictatorial. And many in India believe that the new government in Dhaka is condoning attacks on Hindu minorities and getting too close to anti-India political parties. In short, it seems that India is losing Bangladesh. But this isn't the first time something like this has happened. India and Bangladesh have gone from close friends to clashing rivals once before. In 1971, India helped Bangladesh gain independence from Pakistan, which was a massive victory that reshaped the region. But within just a few years, India lost Bangladesh, and the two countries were rivals. On this episode of Threadbare, we tell you about this forgotten story and how India and Bangladesh went from friends to rivals. Our story begins with the 1971 war, when India defeated Pakistan and helped create Bangladesh. India's support of the Bengali rebels led by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman helped bring about the creation of the new state of Bangladesh. This was a monumental achievement, and naturally, India and Bangladesh became close allies. They signed a treaty of friendship and cooperation in 1972, and Sheikh Mujib declared that Bangladesh's friendship with India would be a cornerstone of the country's foreign policy. However, things didn't stay rosy for too long. Within just a couple of years, India and Bangladesh were bitter rivals. So how exactly did that happen? Well, in the initial years after independence, Bangladesh was struggling. The 1971 war had devastated the country, and its economy was in ruins. Ordinary people began to blame India for some of their troubles. They began to feel that India's businesses were taking advantage of the situation in Bangladesh by indulging in smuggling and dumping substandard products into Bangladesh's market. There were complaints that India was drying up Bangladesh's rivers by controlling water resources. Some scholars like Avinash Paliwal argue that there was some truth to these suspicions. For example, India's army had taken weapons and supplies from Pakistan after the war back home to India. These were seen as trophies of war, but they were war stores that Bangladesh desperately needed. This led to a popular myth that India was stealing Bangladesh's national wealth. Paliwal also finds evidence that Indian businesses did actually dump low-quality businesses in Bangladesh, which made the national situation worse. Soon, anti-India sentiments in Bangladesh became popular and began to rise extremely quickly. India also began to run into a problem with Sheikh Mujibur Rahman himself. While Sheikh Mujib was keen to work closely with India and called himself a friend of New Delhi, he did not want India's influence to grow too much in his country. He sidelined pro-India leaders within his own party and even worked with critics of India like Maulana Bhashani, who was a famous Islamic cleric who saw New Delhi's influence in Bangladesh as a form of domination. Anti-India sentiment was actually useful to Mujib, who used it to distract from his troubles at home. By the mid-1970s, India had lost quite a bit of influence in Bangladesh. But despite this, it continued to back Sheikh Mujib's government in Dhaka. Unfortunately, this would turn out to be an unwise decision. In 1974, Bangladesh faced a devastating famine that killed hundreds of thousands of people, and corruption within the government was a big factor in creating this crisis. In response to criticism and popular discontent, Mujib became more and more authoritarian. He created a one-party state and used a brutal security force called the JRB to maintain control over the country. India actually helped train the security force. Scholars like Avinash Paliwal argue that India made a big mistake here by relying too much on one leader, Sheikh Mujib. India was willing to support him even when he became dictatorial and corrupt. Now, why did India do something like this just a couple of years after helping create a democratic Bangladesh? Well, Paliwal and other scholars argue that India really had a couple of limited interests in Bangladesh. It wanted to protect the country's Hindu minority since communal attacks generated massive political tensions in India. These communal attacks also led to waves of refugees arriving in India, which also became a political problem, particularly in India's northeast. India also wanted to make sure that the government in Dhaka did not provide support to insurgent groups in India's northeast. These groups, like the Mizo rebels for example, had received Pakistani support when Bangladesh was still part of Pakistan as East Pakistan. And finally, India wanted to keep countries like Pakistan and China from gaining too much influence on its eastern front. Despite his many faults, Sheikh Mujib delivered on all of these Indian concerns. And this meant that India was happy to do business with Mujib and backed his government despite his efforts to dismantle Bangladesh's democracy. To put it simply, India's security took precedence over Bangladesh's democracy. This policy of picking one friendly leader at the expense of all others, and even at the expense of Bangladesh's democracy, ultimately backfired. Amid growing public discontent in the 1970s, a group of army officers assassinated Sheikh Mujib in August 1975, along with most of his family. This was a deeply shocking event to India, which had failed to prevent his death and was now left with few close allies in Bangladesh. After his death, a new government took over under Khantakar Mushtaq Ahmed. But things did not get better for India. Mushtaq appointed pro-Pakistan ministers, flirted with increasing Islamism, and did more business with Pakistan and China. Things were so bad that in late 1975, India's military was even prepared to use force against Bangladesh to support pro-India forces. So to be clear, India was considering intervening in another country's politics, not to restore Bangladesh's democracy or to build stable institutions. Its goal was to bring pro-India forces back to power, which may have turned out to be the wrong policy, because in the chaotic years that followed the death of Sheikh Mujib, General Ziaur Rahman took power in Bangladesh and further distanced his country from India. To put pressure on him in 1976, the Research and Analysis Wing, India's external intelligence agency, began an active campaign to pressurize the new Bangladeshi government. This included funding anti-government rebel groups and countering Pakistan's growing intelligence presence to destabilize the regime in Dhaka. In response, General Zia eventually restarted funding for insurgent groups in India's northeast, which is one of the key goals that India had wanted to avoid. He pulled Bangladesh closer to Pakistan and China, and even pushed some India-Bangladesh disputes over water sharing into international forums in a deliberate attempt to pressurize India. And so that was how India went from being one of Bangladesh's closest partners to a rival and an opponent. But why exactly did this happen? Scholar Avinash Palewal has this to say. India lost the peace in Bangladesh because it became obsessed with security. Instead of strengthening democratic institutions, India limited its Bangladesh policy to preventing a Hindu exodus and denying space to Pakistan, China, the United States, and northeastern rebels. Whoever could deliver on those policies was considered pro-India. And India's failure to achieve security in its Near East was testament to an acute failure of imagination on how to treat a smaller neighbor and deliver on democratic constitutionalism. Some critics would argue that India still hasn't learned very much. For example, let's look at what happened with Sheikh Hasina. Her pro-India positions on the economy, infrastructure, security, and general geopolitics meant that India was willing to work with her, despite the fact that she was increasingly unpopular at home for corruption, rigging elections, and authoritarianism. The February 2024 elections this year, for example, that Sheikh Hasina's party won, were widely seen as rigged by the Bangladeshi people. But India didn't really say much about it. And by the time her government fell in August this year, India was too closely associated with her brand. And the Bangladeshi public's anger towards her has now also been directed at India. Bangladesh's new interim government, headed by Yunus, will be under increased domestic pressure to take more and more hardline positions toward India. And that will only keep tensions between India and Bangladesh high in the coming few years. But it also gives India the chance to take a fresh look at its policy and learn from the mistakes of the past. Thanks for watching Threadbare with me, Shashank Mattu. You can catch me again next week on India Today Global.